Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for an inspiring conversation about how social media shapes our opinions. My name is Andrew Dawson, and I'm your moderator for this morning. I'm a Laurier alumnus and PhD student in the social psychology program. So as we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that Wilfrid Laurier University's campuses are located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples. So, in alignment with Laurier's strategic plan, the Inspiring Conversation series seeks to elevate a range of perspectives and ideas, including those of our Indigenous colleagues. So, the sharing of knowledge is powerful and a foundational step towards reconciliation. We are grateful to share this space where we can hear, speak to, and learn from one another. Perhaps you're joining us from another location, and in that case, I would encourage you to take a moment to honor the Indigenous peoples who have lived and worked where you reside historically and presently. Acknowledging them reminds us of our important connection to this land where we live, learn, and work. We recognize, honor, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the land and the water. In a few moments, we'll hear from each of our panelists about the research and perspectives on the influence of social media. And then we will open up our conversation to the audience. So feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A box as we go, and I'll pose them to our panelists a little later. So to begin the conversation, I would like to introduce our speakers, Juan Morales and Ann Wilson. Juan S. Morales is an assistant professor of economics at Laurier's Lazardis School of Business and Economics. He is an applied microeconomist, working in the fields of political economy and developmental economics, with a particular interest in conflict, media, political communication, and legislative behavior. Ann Wilson is a professor in Laurier's Department of Psychology and part of our social psychology program. So she is fascinated by people and how they behave, think, and understand themselves in their social worlds. So thank you both for sharing your time with us this morning. And I will turn the floor over to Juan.
Okay, thanks so much, Andrew, for the introduction. Thanks, everybody, for being here, and thanks to the organizers for this opportunity to share some of my research on social media and politics. Now, when we think about traditional acts of political participation, we usually think of things like voting, signing petitions, maybe writing to your representatives, your MPs, or your mayor's office, perhaps participating in protests, or maybe canvassing for some candidates. But over the last 15 years, we've seen this radical change in political environments. And in particular, social media has been widely adopted by both citizens, but also politicians. Here, I'm documenting with some colleagues this rise in the adoption of social media by US congressional candidates. And what you can see here is that in 2008, really a very, very tiny minority of these candidates were using social media, whereas by the 2018 US congressional elections, we had that between 60 and 70% of US congressional candidates were using Twitter as a tool to actively communicate with their potential voters. Now, what this has meant is that it has really changed the way that we sort of communicate. And in particular, it has led to this emergence of what some researchers have called these tiny acts of political participation. So you can think of something like liking something, hearting something, giving it a thumbs up, retweeting it, sharing it, and all these sort of tiny interactions that we do on social media, which are this new way of communicating with each other, of expressing our opinions, and of learning about others' views, but also potentially a new way of interacting directly with politicians, and for politicians to see what individuals are thinking and how individuals are feeling about certain policies or certain ideas. But one thing that's true that I'm going to sort of document and that I've seen is that only really a minority of users are participating, despite the fact that this is available to many of us. Only a minority of people are really participating in some of these actions, but also being influenced potentially also by these interactions. And that's something that we have to think about and how this reflects. Now, let me show you some examples of that we can talk about. So one key feature of social media is the fact that it displays social information. So here I'm showing you a recent tweet by our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And you can see here that this was published in a couple of days ago. And we can see the social interactions that it received, right? So you can see that it had 3,500 likes, 684 retweets, and about 2,000 comments. And this is telling for a few reasons, is that you can see some support, but you can also see a lot of comments. And in particular, comments usually contain some forms of negative engagement. Now we can contrast this with another recent tweet by the leader of the Conservative Party, where he, again, this is a tweet from a few days ago, and he was getting about 6,000 likes and less comments, right? So these are sort of forms of positive engagement and negative engagement that the information is contained there, and contains some social signals that can actually reflect true public sentiment. Now, this is not true just in this sort of anecdotal sense, but in some of my studies, I have documented how this sort of can be more broader than this. So in particular here, I'm going to show you two things. So here on the left, you can see that follower engagement, which is this blue line right here, and it's showing month by month a measure of how many likes and how many retweets the president of Colombia was getting. And that's correlated with traditional polls that were asking people, do you support the president? This is also true in the case of Poland. This is another something we documented in a separate study. Very similarly, follower engagement, likes and retweets for these politicians correlated over time with how they were doing in traditional polls. So to a certain extent, this social media engagement and this information that is contained in these signals reflects something that is true about the world more generally. And some leaders can be particularly sensitive to how they are perceived. So you may remember the case of Donald Trump and how much he cared about how he was portrayed and how popular he was on social media, and of course more broadly. Now, of course, these may be because social media engagement is actually correlated with these measures of public opinion and potentially with electoral outcomes. But also, in turn, it could be that these perceptions of this social information can maybe also in turn affect political behavior and potentially also affect political opinions. And in some of my studies, I've documented how this could be the case. So let me tell you about a few of those. So in one study, in the case of Venezuela, I was looking precisely at this. So I was examining the levels of engagement with the president of Venezuela. And what you can see here is the following. So each scatter point in this plot shows a tweet is represented by two scatter points. One shows the number of retweets that tweet got. And in the red here, you see the number of likes that tweet has. And so he became president around here when Chavez died. And very quickly, he seemed to amass this following of people that were sort of retweeting and supporting him on social media. And what you see here is that in October of 2013, all of a sudden, we see this big drop in the number of retweets that he's getting. And what happened was that on October 31st, Twitter actually shut off around 6,000 accounts, which were programmed to automatically retweet everything that he was tweeting. So the president of Venezuela would tweet something, and these accounts were programmed to automatically retweet it. Now, these accounts represented less than 0.5% of all of his followers, but around 80% of his retweets. Now, what I studied here is, first of all, you can see this big drop in the retweets, and then we can sort of see what happened after as well to other things. And what I find is that soon after these accounts were shut off by Twitter, criticism of Nicolás Maduro increased, but also support for the opposition, again, measured by these measures of social media engagement, increased. So both of these things increased right after. So this shows us that this perceived popularity can actually affect online political expression, and that the perceptions online actually may be distorted and lead to some sort of spiral of silence. And this is particularly true if you think about us being social creatures and wanting to conform and be part of certain groups. So in this particular case, what you can imagine is that these members of the that were opposition supporters may have been afraid to actually speak up and show their support for the opposition because it appeared that Nicolas Maduro had more support than he truly had, given this. In a separate study, we're looking more directly at these precise mechanisms of the levels of engagement and how they could potentially actually change also policy opinions. So what we did is we conducted an online survey experiment with participants in the US, Italy, and Ireland. And this was during the time of COVID, when you will remember, there was this very active debate about government regulation and this potential trade-off between public health and economic activity. So we showed participants in our study some tweets about these issues. And in particular, you can imagine here looking at, take a look at these two tweets. So one tweet said something like, if we open up schools, summer activities, and small businesses, the economy will move faster. It's time to reopen, right? So this tweet was, let's call it a pro-economy tweet. And on the other hand, here we had a more pro-public health tweet, which said, why are people pushing for more relaxing of the lockdown? People are still being admitted to hospitals. This is not under control. And for one group of participants, we show them these two tweets, but the tweet on the left would appear with more support. So it has a higher number of likes, higher number of retweets, whereas the tweet on the right had low levels of support. And the other set of participants in our experiment would see the exact same tweets. So the information that they were seeing is the same, but they would see the reverse in terms of the online support, the engagement, the endorsements that these views were getting. And then after the experiment, we surveyed them about their policy preferences. So we asked them, what do you think about closing businesses? What do you think about prohibiting gatherings? And on average, we find no effect of these engagement metrics. However, when we look at active social media users, so those who we classify as using Facebook or Twitter for more than 2 hours a day, these users did appear to change their view. So it did appear to be the case that active social media users changed their mind about this policy regulation because they saw that some of these tweets had more support than others. The effect was further concentrated on a minority of users. So about really 1/3 of users are active social media users, and further 1/3 of those active social media users were actually paying attention to these metrics. So the way we measured this is we asked them very straightforward a question of, did you notice the likes? What was the level of support? And we see whether they answered this correctly or not. And the people that answered correctly, meaning that they actually had checked the likes and the retweets, these are the people that had been influenced by this level of support and that appear to change their mind as a result. Now, the effect also seemed to reinforce previously held views, potentially contributing to opinion polarization, and only a minority of users was affected. However, these active social media users tend to be more politically active. So this is something to have in mind when we think about these studies. The next study that I'm going to tell you about is thinking about how the platforms, the interventions of the platforms can actually have some big effects. So on October 20th, 2020, Twitter changed the way that the retweet button worked. And what they did is that they changed the default functionality such that when you would click the retweet button, it wouldn't automatically retweet. Instead, it would prompt what we called a quote tweet. Now, what we found was that right after Twitter changed this, of the way that the button worked, news sharing significantly decreased. So what we measure here is how many retweets are the US media outlets getting, and we find this drop of about 15% for all these US media outlets after the button was changed. But what was most interesting was that the effect was much larger for left-wing media relative to right-wing and conservative media. So what we found was that the drop in sharing was of about 20 to 25% for media that is classified as being liberal, and only about 5% for media that is classified as being conservative. Further, we document that conservative users were less responsive to these Twitter's prompts, so they were more likely to just ignore it and go ahead with a retweet anyway. And we also find that the user interface change actually affected web traffic to these news websites. So we can go and see how many people are visiting these websites, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, and we can track and see the change in traffic as a result of this. So this highlights really the power of these platforms to actually steer information diffusion and the potential unintended consequences of some of these interventions. Finally, let me tell you about one last thing to have in mind. So in this other study, we're asking people some opinions about potentially controversial issues and their willingness to post these opinions online. And we find that, first of all, people are very polarized on certain things. But on top of that, the people that tend to hold the most extreme views, so those that are here, let's say on the left or here on the right, are actually more willing to post those opinions online. So let me just conclude with a little bit of a discussion and an introspection that you can think about in the way you use social media and potentially what it means. So what I've told you is that our online actions really are kind of these tiny acts of political participation. So you want to think about what do you want others to see when you're amplifying something, when you're retweeting something. And what do you also want your future selves to see? Because if this is acting as a vote, it's acting as a vote also for what you think the algorithms are learning from this and telling you, showing you more of these things that you're interacting with. Finally, think about how those perceptions may influence what you think and whether you think you may be influenced by what you're seeing on social media and to what extent. And also, what type of social media are you? Do you think you would be respond to some of these interventions by the platforms? Do you tend to share a lot, or do you tend to be a more passive user? And potentially, if you are a more moderate user and you think you're seeing all these let's say, extreme views online, well, you can know that there's other moderate users that potentially are not participating as much as they should. Anyway, I'll close here, and I'm looking forward to your questions. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing, Juan. And now we'll hear from Anne.
Okay. I think that's up. Flag me if it's not. So thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this today and for all of you participating as part of the audience. It's great to see a crowd. And I really enjoyed listening to Juan's talk. So what I decided to do today was slightly higher level. So I think it's a nice complementary sort of approach. Juan told you about a number of his specific studies, and I'm going to tell you about a few broader themes, each of which we've done some research on in my lab, in some cases using some methods quite similar to Juan's. And I'd be happy to answer questions about those later on. So Juan told you a lot about society and government and political participation. And I'm going to focus a bit more on the psychological element of these kinds of questions. So the framing of this webinar had to do with whether social media has changed how we think and what we do. And I want to answer in a dual way. So on one hand, the answer is no. Social media hasn't really changed the fundamental psychological and social tendencies that humans have, because we all have just the propensity to cognitive error, to distress, to misinformation, to political conflict. Social media hasn't created any of those patterns for people. And so one answer might be that, social media, we might wring our hands and say that it's really changed things in a dramatic way, but perhaps it actually hasn't. On the other hand, we could answer this question with a yes. So although there are these fundamental psychological tendencies, social media tends to scale up these tendencies, to amplify them, to potentially change our perception of what the social norms are, sometimes in ways that are incorrect. And as Juan mentioned, to preserve our actions indefinitely and then to change what we see next, because as we do things, algorithms are tracking what we're doing, adjusting what we see, and delivering potentially an intensifying kind of feedback loop over time. So remember that social media companies are profit-driven, and so what they're doing with our data is not necessarily for our best interests. So I have a general overarching goal for the moments that I'm going to be talking today. And what I want to do is explore several examples where you can think about the psychology of normal human behavior, and then you can think about how social media amplifies or transforms that. So I'll start with one example that doesn't have to do with politics, but is one that's probably familiar to many of you, and it has to do with social comparison. This is a very human tendency. We have been keeping up with the Joneses and checking whether the grass is greener since time immemorial, right? But social media, social comparison, ratchets that up several levels because now we have a constant source of comparison. It's curated, it's altered to be more perfect, and it's sort of a continuous access to superior others. And so it can distort our sense of our standing in the world because of what we're being fed in social media. So that's one example, but I want to talk mostly about more political examples, and I'll give three. So the first is misinformation and fake news. It's one of the topics that we've been investigating in my lab. And just generally, this isn't our research, but researchers for a number of years have been collecting data on false information and how it spreads online. In one big study, they found that relative to true stories, false stories spread faster and they reach more people. So they have more reach than true stories, partly because they're not constrained by the truth, right? So they can frame whatever the message is in a way that is most likely to really grab our attention, or you could say that they're viral by design. So this is true for normal human tendencies. We have a tendency called the confirmation bias to be attracted to information that's consistent with whatever we believed previously. And because of that, we tend to fall for falsehoods that are consistent with our prior beliefs. This is the kind of fake news we're especially likely to accept without really scrutinizing. So that happens just normally. What about in social media space? Same thing happens, but now we have the capacity to curate a much larger set of preferred viewpoints, right? We can pick and choose from all these sources of information in a much more ready way. And by doing this, we can end up creating echo chambers of like-minded people and like-minded positions. And then that can be amplified further and shared further by us. So this is something that, again, is sort of like taking the normal human tendency and turbocharging it. One of the topics we've been studying the most in my lab over the last few years is politics and political polarization, the psychology of intergroup conflict in this context. And once again, we start with a very normal human tendency. People have always formed in-groups and out-groups. We have division between these groups, mistrust and dislike. And we have always had, as far as democratic politics go, we need to have some clear difference between parties and robust disagreement among parties. So these things are not new, and they don't need social media to exist. What happens when we add social media, though, to these sorts of contexts? So we know that political polarization and animosity is at record highs in the US and Canada and some other places worldwide. And people are not just disliking their opponents, they're coming to hate them, to refuse to engage with them, and to believe really terrible things about them. So animosity for our political opponents is really rising in many contexts, and social media has been implicated. And one of the things that's really important to highlight there is that although we're disliking our opponents more and more, it's not because we're getting further and further away from them on positions and policies and social values in a lot of cases. So in many cases, there's more common ground than we recognize. And the things that we hate our opponents for are actually beliefs that they don't even largely hold. So we tend to have misconceptions that way. So why does this happen? At least part of the reason from a social media perspective is that rather than reflecting the world, social media acts more like a house of mirrors, right? Or a funhouse mirror. And this reflects a little bit in some of this stuff that Juan was talking about, that the people who are engaging in social media are not necessarily representative of everyone out there. And I want to highlight that bots are also a big part of that. So social media creates a distorted view of reality, and the extreme voices are the loudest disproportionately. Moderates tend to be muted. So we get a really miscalibrated view of what other people actually believe. And so there are at least 3 reasons why extremists especially get amplified. First reason, psychologically, is that it's something about them, something about the extremists. So we know that personality of heavy media engagers tends to be different. So they're more narcissistic, they tend to be a little more antisocial, sometimes more extroverted. So there's a number of qualities about them. We also know that those who are really politically engaged tend to produce the majority of the tweets. So about 10% of users produce 80% of political tweets in a couple of studies. So that's one thing. It can be about the extremists. It can also be about the social media companies. So I mentioned the business model is an attention economy. They're trying to keep our attention as long as they can. And one of the ways to do that is by getting as much engagement, right? They need to keep us paying attention and clicking. And social media companies know that one of the things that keeps us engaged is strong negative emotions. So for example, a few years ago, it was leaked that Facebook was weighting emojis like angry about 5 times more than things like likes, which are more pleasant. And that's because those kinds of reactions tend to keep our attention. So you're more likely to see those things circulate in social media. Finally, it's also something about us, right? So we're also to blame for these extremists. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is something called negativity bias. So as humans, we tend to pay more attention to bad stuff than to good stuff. This is probably evolutionary. It's probably for our survival because it's important for us to pay attention to and react to threats. But in social media space, it's going to be more along the lines of if it makes me mad, I'm paying attention to it. Or as Johan Hari said, if it's enraging, it's engaging. We also are not just passive users of all of this stuff, right? So we're actively deciding what we share and what we do with all of this information. And so we disproportionately share certain kinds of information that comes across our feeds. Moral emotional posts and hate sharing are a couple of types of things that get shared quite frequently. So this is an example of one study looking at how moral emotional words, so these are words like blame, steal, greed, destroy, how they end up prompting or boosting the sharing of tweets. And you can see because of the colors here, these are representing echo chambers of liberal and conservatives. So the tweets are being shared more frequently when they have these outrage kinds of words in them. So psychologically, another important thing to consider is that all of this exposure to the worst in our opponents tends to bring out the worst in us as well. One thing that happens is that we become more loyal to our parties, even bad ideas and bad behavior. We give it a pass if we think that at least they're better than the other side. It also tends to inhibit in-group dissent, speaking up. So this is also a connection with Juan's talk. And in-group dissent can be really critical for course correction, for critically thinking about where your party is going. So not having people not speak up is something to really consider. So in some of our research, we are using methods similar to what Juan showed you, where we show different kinds of tweets and expose people to civil but moderate in-group dissent, right? So civil disagreement among group members. And we're finding that it helps to reduce the gap in cross-party misperception and some of the animosity that we perceive. Last thing I want to tell you about briefly, it's another thing we're starting to study, is the notion of public shaming. So public shaming is, again, nothing new. It's a normal social behavior. Groups punish those who violate norms that are important in their group. So if someone in our group starts to be racist and we disapprove of that, then we may punish them and hurt their reputation. And this can help communities to function smoothly and to maintain some forms of social order. Now, when this happens in a real life community, then what happens is people generally consider the whole person, the context, and so on. And shaming is sometimes even a route to redemption eventually. What happens when it occurs online, though, is a little different. So we sometimes call this canceling. It can happen in much larger networks, sometimes of strangers or near strangers. And we tend to flatten all of the context and circumstance, and we just judge people on the basis of the one bad thing that they did. And sometimes the punishment is really outstripping whatever the offense was. And there's often little chance for redemption. So if people have questions about this, we're doing some research on this topic as well. So I just want to end a little bit more broadly, asking whether this is social media's problem or ours. So is social media just giving us what we want? And again, the answer is yes and no. So it depends on what you mean by what we want. We want a lot of things that aren't so good for us. And social media is maximizing what it's delivering us in ways that can be unhealthy, in the same way that fast food hacks our evolved attraction to fats and sugars. And if we eat as much of it as we might want, that's not going to be so good. So solutions, just things to consider as we're heading back to social media after this. Some of the things that you can think of as you're engaging is just simply to be a little bit more deliberate in what you do. You don't have to follow all the accounts you're following. You can unfollow polarizers and outrage. You can be willing to be the person who dissents or fact checks. You can choose not to do things that help the algorithm to know more about you. And you can curate a more diverse feed that includes more constructive disagreement. And finally, you can log off and meet some real people. Or as Jean Twenge says, let your phone be a tool that you use and not a tool that uses you.
All right, thank you, Anne. And now we would like to take some questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A box and we'll do our best to get to everyone's questions. Okay, first question. Curious about the use of bots on these platforms, impact on perception by increases likes, etc. Thanks for sharing the research. So I think we'll start with Juan on that one.
Thanks, Andrew. And thanks, Anne, for that fascinating. Well, it's a really nice sort of putting everything together. So about bots, yeah. So, I mean, the truth is that we don't have great measures of this. And if we did, we know that basically, if we could detect bots easily, the social media companies would also have detected the bots and have already taken it down, right? So this is why this is kind of like a challenging thing. Now we know that they are there, and of course this is kind of like a whack-a-mole problem, right? So the social media platforms are trying to get rid of the bots kind of show up, and they become more sophisticated, so it's harder to detect, and then they shut them off. Now, some governments we know have engaged in this, right? So this was the case that I highlighted in the case of Venezuela, where we know that the Venezuelan government was in fact taking advantage of this to try to distort the public perception, and it was successful to a certain extent, of course, until these bots were sort of shut off. So these are still there, and in some of my other work, we've sort of used some estimates of what share of followers tend to be bots, and it depends. In that case, was for the U.S. media outlets. So some U.S. media outlets are estimated to have more bots, more followers that are sort of bots. But the truth is that we don't really know, right? And it can vary, over time too, because of these sudden actions that the Twitter platforms can take to just shut off a network, and then that sort of can change things dramatically over time. But it's a good question.
Okay.
I'll just jump in and add one little thing there, which is the psychological reaction to bots can then take on a life of its own, right? So sometimes people will be influenced by bots, but then the way that they respond creates more social norm in and of itself. Another thing that's starting to become more complicated with AI, with deep fakes and so on, is that bots are going to become harder and harder to detect as bots. And in some cases, what can happen is that humans perceive real humans and call them bots, right? So then you have this interesting dehumanization of actual people because we're not sure who's a bot and who's not.
All right. In a similar vein, we have a question on, are you doing research on AI and social media and possible risks in misinformation? I suppose that could apply to either of you.
So far, no, but I have to finish too many projects before I go there. But yeah, that's a good area of research for sure.
Yeah, same thing, not looking at it yet, at least not in this domain, but it's definitely on our radar. I noticed we were both using AI for our images in our slides.
That's right.
All right. Given what we know about the impact of social media on our systems of democracy, should social media companies have a moral or ethical responsibility to its users? It's a broader question.
I can answer it in part. I won't give a definitive answer, but one way of thinking about intervention, at least, is that we often have companies doing all of these things behind the scenes that are really shaping a lot of our behaviors. And then we'll learn about interventions where it's like you can tweak your own behavior in certain ways to fix things, right? But that's not really tackling the source of some of the problems. So one argument is that in cases like that, some systemic adjustments would be important, right? So you could think about something like lead paint as an example in a different domain. You could say, well, we could teach every individual child to stay away from lead paint and make sure that they're not going to consume it and that sort of thing. Or you can say, you know what, we have to get the lead out of paint. And so systemic kinds of interventions may be something we really need to be thinking about, and certainly are being discussed in a lot of places.
I'll add something here. So one thing that we sort of documented as well in the research on the social media sharing and that intervention for Twitter. Well, the first thing you see is that this was an intervention that was very transparent, right? So Twitter kind of advertised it and said, look, everybody, this is what we're doing. We're going to change the retweet button. The idea is to get you to think more about what you're sharing and to be thoughtful about the things that you're sharing. And then this very transparent intervention had these kind of like unintended consequences because people respond differently, right? And different types of people responded differently to this particular intervention. Now, we also documented in a previous version of the working paper, we also documented how Facebook had, let's say, more systemic kind of approaches to clamp down on misinformation, but these were much, much less transparent, right? So there's also these kind of like a trade-off between how transparent you want the policies of the social media platforms to be, and these kind of like, let's say, more hidden algorithmic potential policies that the social media could take that could maybe easily clamp down on some of this misinformation. But at the same time, there's this potential for it to create a backlash against the social media companies themselves, and the potential for people to actually lose trust in the platforms because of these things that are hidden. So there's this very fine line that the social media companies have to tread to kind of think about, okay, how transparent do we want to be with our policies? And if we're not being transparent, is that going to make users lose trust in what they're seeing and in the platforms themselves as well?
All right. So the next question, I think it's more directed at Anne, but I think it should apply to both of your research. So we have someone in the audience who's curious about specific platforms. So have you done any research on particular social media sites, that sort of thing? Are certain platforms more likely to promote certain extreme political opinions? Are certain platforms more right-wing or more left-wing?
So we haven't looked at systematic differences between platforms in our work, but we've been looking into the literature on those kinds of topics. And certainly it seems like different platforms pull for different kinds of things. So certainly some are more left and some are more right. And that might be like a little less of an interesting dynamic. That's just like different people show up in different places. One thing we're interested in with regard to broader platforms, so things like Twitter and other places where a lot of people engage, is some of those algorithms or kinds of policies that might be implemented might include a lot of platform or content moderation. And what users end up experiencing that as is something like censorship. So one thing that happens if people are experiencing, whether it's real or perceived, they're experiencing censorship on one platform, they may end up migrating to another platform. And that can be part of what leads to echo chambers of more right-wing, more left-wing groups of people, because they end up gathering with others who are more like-minded rather in a broader public space. The other thing I'll say about just different platforms is in the literature more generally, people look at different things in different platforms. So for example, Instagram is one of the places, TikTok is one of the places looking at body image and mental health and those sorts of things for younger groups. And Twitter is a big place. Facebook is a big place for politics and for misinformation and so on.
Yeah, I'll add that for sure. I mean, we know we know certain things about certain platforms. In particular, there's been documented that Twitter used to be more of a liberal left-wing platform, but that is also not static, right? So we know this has changed dramatically since sort of Elon Musk came in, and the sort of makeup of the platform has actually changed quite a bit. But it's also the other point is about how we study these platforms, because there's another change that happened recently, and it's that access to the data could be more or less restricted, right? So before Elon Musk came in, there was an academic research track to study Twitter data, and that's a lot of what I used and my co-authors used to access the Twitter data, and that has been shut off by Twitter now, right? So now we don't have access to some of the data that potentially we would like to have to study kind of how these changes are happening and how some platforms are moving from left to right, and we can't see that anymore. So this is another challenge for us as researchers.
Okay. We have someone in the audience who's interested in the link between social media and mental health, particularly if we see anything, any data showing a link there. So particular for social anxiety and for depression.
Well, I can jump in a broad way. So it's not something we're specifically studying, but I'm teaching a course on social psychology of social media. And I can tell you it's one of the big debates. And we could have a whole webinar on that topic. The answer is a bit mixed. So some researchers are quite strongly arguing that the effects on social media are quite profound, and others are arguing that that link is overstated. And part of the problem, I think, is that there are different ways of studying this. A lot of the research is correlational. You can't necessarily tell what's cause and effect and so on. I think my sense is that there's enough evidence coming in that we should be concerned and we should be tracking it in more systematic ways, but we should also not fall into a panic of the sky is falling, everything is terrible. And that a lot of the reason it's hard to track is because people can use social media in so many different ways, and some of them are really quite healthy and others are really unhealthy. So if everybody's on a choose your own adventure, it can be quite difficult to make sweeping generalizations.
Yeah, I think so. I agree with what Anne was saying. There's kind of mixed evidence. Some of the, let's say, more convincing evidence that I have seen on this question uses kind of like the rollout, the staggered adoption of, let's say, Facebook across colleges to show that there is indeed an impact on depression and mental health. But again, this could also be different for different types of people. So I think what we know on this sort of strongest, let's say, evidence that we have does seem to pertain to young people, in particular young women, who seem to be the ones that are potentially most affected negatively by social media.
All right. We have a question for Anne. Given the very good, bad argument of social media, do we have any knowledge, or do you have any expertise on the role of social media in terms of teenagers and children?
So I wonder if this would be a little bit more, so I'll say a couple of things. So one of them would tie to this idea of mental health, and the questions around that have been studied a lot. And another might have more to do with things like attention and distraction and the possibility of something like social media addiction. And a third may have to do with the kinds of social interactions that can be happening online that might be unmonitored. And in some cases, there might be cyberbullying or other kinds of access to stuff that's not really age appropriate. I think it's a really tricky thing to navigate. There are some debates in the States going on about really just cutting off social media access to kids before a certain age. It's not clear to me yet whether that would be a feasible intervention. I think that one of the ideas is that kids below a certain age really are not developmentally able to navigate all of the complexity, and parents are really not able to monitor what they're doing. So there's just a mismatch there. So far, we know, though, that, kids can sign into lots of social media with just a fake age or other things like that. So things would have to change pretty systemically for these kinds of alterations to really take hold. The idea of changing norms for kids, where it's not expected that everybody has a phone from a very young age and they're not doing all of their interactions in that way, that might be something that a lot of parents should be considering. And the more parents do it together, the less it's like individual parents who are saying no, and then they're the baddies, right? So I think that's one of the reasons to consider doing it as a regulation. The other thing that I think is just going to have to be true is that we need to take seriously teaching social media literacy and some skills so that kids know how to navigate these things, because it's going to be a reality for their lives. So if they can learn skills as they're starting to engage, I think that will be helpful.
I will underscore what Anne just mentioned about the lone parent trying to fight against sort of these collective. So this is really economics, what we call sort of a collective problem, right? Because you can imagine if everybody else has social media and your child wants social media and all his friends have social media, this is very difficult, right? So this is where this kind of regulation, either at the school level or potentially province level, this kind of regulation that can help set norms and help us sort of push away so that we can limit some of the harms, I think is important. I agree with that.
Okay. So one person wants to know if either of you are studying the impact of misinformation on social media health support groups. So specifically looking at chronic illnesses that are less socially acceptable, like long COVID. But I personally more generally would be interested in if there's misperceptions about mental health or that sort of thing going around, if that relates to either of your research.
So I'm not studying that specifically. I am looking at misinformation. I can say a little bit about these misperceptions of mental health, though, because I happen to be teaching a class and really digging into some of this research. So I'm teaching a seminar, and I had my students vote on the topics they were most interested in. And one of them has to do with these more rare mental health disorders and how social media may play out. I don't know if this is exactly the same sort of thing as what the question had in mind. But one thing that can happen in those spaces is something like what happens with astrology or other things like that, where there will be communicators, so influencers will communicate a list of pretty vague symptoms or vague experiences that you might have, and then tie it to some kind of disorder, right? And so people who have a diffuse sense that something is wrong can sometimes find themselves in communities self-diagnosing because of these ambiguous symptoms. And many disorders do have ambiguous symptoms, so it can be really tricky. On the other hand, social media can also play a role in helping people to find communities who do know something about an illness that's rare, because a lot of times when you actually are dealing with a genuine concern, it might be hard to find people who know or who can support you through that. So there's a lot of positives as well, right? So it can destigmatize, it can help you to find support groups, but at the same time, in some cases, it might end up leading you down rabbit holes and self-diagnosing with something that perhaps you don't have.
I am not doing work on social media health support groups.
Okay. Okay, so one question. We'll start with Anne. Some people call cancel culture accountability culture, so they're reframing it in a sense. Do you think there's a difference in that case?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have gone back and forth in my lab. We've done the reading. So one thing I'll say is that there's all kinds of debate about cancel culture and related phenomena, and there's relatively little research on it yet. So it's still an emerging field. There's not as much research as you might expect. So one thing we've been trying to do in our lab is to define what cancel culture versus accountability culture might actually look like if we wanted to more systematically consider that there are probably two different phenomena that are happening. So something like accountability culture may well be a case where people sometimes are engaging in some kind of collective action online, relatively powerless people who strength in numbers allows something to be done about a real injustice, right? So pushing for a powerful person to be held accountable for something. I think there are cases where that kind of social shaming online can really be quite effective. You can think about some prominent cases during Me Too, for example, and so on, right? On the other hand, cancel culture, the way we've been defining it, highlights a lot of the negatives, or in my perception, at least negatives. Not everybody would see the same negatives, but cases where potentially pretty minor or ambiguous offenses are punished online in what appears to be maybe a miscalibrated way. So people who lose their jobs for, one ill-stated joke or, various things like that. And those cases can happen too. They get a lot of press when they happen, so we might think that they're more common than they really are. But it's also important to recognize that even if they're not that common, they may chill speech for other people if other people are worried about the consequences of speaking their mind for minor things and stepping on something that they didn't realize they're going to step on. So one of the things we've been doing then is trying to distinguish those and looking at whether or not even there are different personality characteristics in different situations where people might respond to one or the other. So for example, we find that some people who have those extremist, more antisocial personality traits really jump on cancel culture kinds of bandwagons. But people who have more of a justice orientation and more empathy and more concern for prejudice and various things like that are more likely to respond to something that's more of an accountability culture situation. So we're still working that out, but I do think that there is a distinction, and it's one that I think often isn't made when we're having those debates in the public square. And so we end up talking past each other sometimes.
I'll add that in one of our recent studies, one that I mentioned very briefly at the end, is really trying to tackle some of these issues, and in particular these issues that there could be sort of strong social pressure that people feel, and then they're less likely to sort of speak up. And where these norms are actually, so what we find is with this online survey experiment, we find is that where these norms tend to be, sort of the social norms of, let's say, what could be more acceptable, do tend to coincide with sort of these left-wing liberal norms, right? And people that have more views that differ from these left-wing liberal norms tend to be less likely to, let's say, voice their opinion. So that we do see evidence of that. We also see, we do some experiments in which we ask people, would you be willing to post your opinion online on certain issues? And we also find that people actually conform, in a sense that if we are asking people to be public about their views, they tend to say something that tends to be more liberal to what they like, compared to groups where we don't tell them that their views may be made public. But another thing we find that is really interesting is that Republicans and people that are more conservative also say that they worry more about, let's say, cancel culture. But when we do these experimental interventions in which we tell them about cancel culture and we say, well, maybe this could be a problem, they're actually also less responsive to those. So even though they're more worried, they're also less likely to censor themselves, right? So there's kind of this interesting tension there. And then finally, the other thing that we do in that study that I think is important is that we tend to think about, let's say, censorship or free speech very often as kind of like a binary variable. Yes, there's censorship. No, there's no censorship. But we should really think about this as a continuous variable. And we should think about, okay, what's the optimal level of, let's say, social pressure? And what we show is indeed that some social pressure is not necessarily a bad thing, because it makes people that really care about these issues speak up, and people that don't care about these issues speak up less. And to a certain extent, from a welfare perspective, what we show in that paper, we document that from a welfare perspective, that can actually be welfare enhancing, because some people that don't have, let's say, strong opinions and very strong opinions, or they're not very invested in some issues, should have less of a say when we're trying to discuss some issue in general. So that's kind of another thing that we should have in mind when we think about what social pressure is and what it does.
All right, great. We have time for one more question. And this one starts with a throwback to during the pandemic when Jagmeet Singh and AOC were on Twitch stream. I think they were playing Among Us or something like that. So what do you think about discussing political issues in a gaming environment? Does this forum influence what people think about politicians? Does it grow parasocial relationships? And I think we could broaden it a bit beyond video games to just parasocial relationships in general or different forms of engagement.
I think this is really interesting. I haven't seen many studies on this, but one thing that we sort of tend to think about is this idea of echo chambers and the fact that we are sort of isolated in our sort of social media environments. And potentially this could be one way of sort of breaking out of those echo chambers, right? If you think about exposing your ideas or exposing some political issues to different types of people that perhaps are not as politically engaged. So if AOC tweets something, only her followers are going to see it. People that follow her, people that like her, or people that don't like her and comment on her. Those are the people that are going to see that stuff, right? But when she goes on these alternative platforms, I think that's a great way of trying to sort of bring more people into these political conversations. People that may be, let's say, more disengaged to begin with. So that's an interesting thing. I honestly haven't seen much work on this, but it is really interesting to think about.
Yeah, you could think of it as a pretty savvy move for politicians to think about different platforms that different demographics are going to be accessing. So if you stick with, say, Twitter and Facebook, you're going to get a lot of the like politically engaged and older crowds in many cases. But you may actually be missing, at least based on the last stats that I've seen about who's using what platforms, you're going to be missing a lot of younger people, and many politicians probably want to be reaching those folks. The notion of parasocial relationships, I think, is an interesting piece of that too. So for anybody that doesn't know what that term is basically like feeling like you have a friendship kind of relationship with someone that's one-sided. So you feel warmly towards a person because you've seen them interact so much online, even though they don't necessarily, interact back with you. And this has been something that's been identified certainly for celebrities, for influencers, and so on. And I think it could probably also be true for politicians. So it may be that some political candidates are moving into the influencer space in that way. I think AOC has used TikTok and other kinds of platforms too. So she's probably right at that cusp of being able to use multiple platforms for those sorts of things.
Right. So we're going to have to wrap it up, but thank you to everyone who submitted questions. Sorry, we couldn't quite get to all of them. Juan and Ann, thank you so much for participating. It was a pleasure speaking with both of you. And thank you all for attending and your interest in Laurier research. So we're going to send a link a little later to the recording. If you enjoyed today's event, please join us on March 6th for our next inspiring conversation, What It Feels Like for a Mom, Cultural Understandings of Motherhood. Have a great day.